Peter, this first question is for you. All in the Sound. It is both the title piece of the album and the title of the album and the first piece on the album. And what does this piece mean in that context? And what does it tell the listener about the album that they're just beginning to experience?
There's a lot of different resonances with both that piece, that statement, and the movement that that phrase comes from. The two song piece itself was one that I wrote for Katie at the start of her and my collaborative relationship. I should say Katie Purcell, soprano and longtime collaborator of mine. And our collaboration started with a concert in which she performed a lot of my art songs, including that piece, which I specifically wrote for that concert. So I would consider it kind of one of the main markers of my artistic journey as a composer of art song. But also, the line comes from the second movement, which is from a poem by William Carlos Williams entitled The Poem. And so the poem itself is a kind of creative manifesto speaking to Williams's modernist poetic aesthetics, and is kind of in my mind, a presentation or a declaration of the power of art song itself. The poem is saying what a poem should be, and it says that a poem should be a song made of particulars, wasps, gentian, something particular, open scissors, a lady's eyes, and it's exactly that mix of lyricism as well as visceral and concrete images, which undergirds my creative process for making an art song, for selecting a poem that I want to set to music, and just speaks to the joyous act of bringing poetry to life through music.
Can I add to that? What you said, Peter, just thinking of the text of this poem titled The Poem, and it opens with this like fabulous line of "It's all in the sound." It's a reminder that poetry is meant to be heard and not just read.
Valerie, my next question is for you about Just a Leaf. As you know far better than I, each movement requires very intense rhythmic control from the pianist. It requires this in different ways in different movements. But within the first movement, with its enormous measures and its lack of time signatures and its prime number rhythmic patterns, this one's really particularly a tour de force. Please talk about your experience bringing this to life.
So, Ryan, and this is embarrassing to say in front of Peter, I had forgotten it doesn't have time signatures. Maybe I never noticed, or maybe I just forgot. But I think the reason why let's just say I forgot is because I am constantly counting in this. As I'm playing, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's the only way to stay on track with this piece. And I will say, I think my part is, even though there are a lot of notes, I think it's probably easier to learn than the voice part, because there is kind of this anchor of that kind of rhythmic driving left hand pattern that I can cling to, while the vocalist doesn't have that. And the singer just sort of has to know and count in a different way. But I think beyond counting, the other kind of trick or tactic that helps me stay on track with this piece is really just extreme focus. As a collaborative pianist, so much of the work is about anticipation. It's about anticipating breath. It's about anticipating certain consonants. It's about intuiting when a phrase will just sort of expand a bit, or when a phrase needs to push. But in this piece, you really have to resist that temptation. I just sort of have to stay hyper focused on the vertical of where I am. It's almost like reading with blinders, staying in that absolute precision. But I'm curious, Peter, was it the premiere of this piece that we performed it together, that Peter sang while I played? So you've performed it as a singer. What was that experience like for you?
I love this. First of all, I absolutely love the idea that the first movement engenders intense focus, because that there's a wonderful, completely unintended or unanticipated parallel to the text itself, which is this kind of manic, fixated, bring a leaf to me, just a leaf, just a spring leaf, an April leaf, just come. The poem itself is so tightly focused on a few phrases, a few images, that I love that there's a performative parallel there. But boy, I'm thinking back to, yes, we did perform the premiere together, and I'm so grateful for you going on that journey with me. I think that while it was important to me to give the premiere, because with the amount of liberty I was taking or the amount I was demanding of the singer, I felt it important to, in solidarity, execute the piece myself to prove that it could be done. If anyone was to say it couldn't, or maybe shouldn't, to say that I did it. And I will admit that I had a bit of a cheater's leg up in that I wrote the piece. And so while I still had to be counting for that first entrance of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, bring a leaf to me, just a leaf, just a spring leaf, I still had a certain amount of visceral connection with writing it and having the memory of what it was to be writing it and discovering it. But sometimes you stick the landing and sometimes you don't. And while there is a certain disconnect between the performers, I think there is actually a generosity there where within a certain margin of error, if you're off just a tiny bit on an entrance, you can catch up again. You can come back together at whatever the next point of entry is in a way that pieces that maybe you would have more of that expanding and contracting in order to stay together. If you got off in that same way, it would be obvious and exposed.
So I think it's interesting, Peter. You just said that there's a certain disconnect between the performers. And I very much strongly disagree with that. I don't feel any sort of disconnect from the singer with this piece, especially since the way it's written, so many of the gestures are almost in response to the singer. It's not, melodic in the way that like Botticelli and Trees, which we're going to talk about later, right? It's not like the instrumental line and the voice line intersect in certain ways, but so many of my right hand entrances are like reacting to something the singer sings. And so there is interplay. So I don't feel disconnected, even though maybe in the practicality of learning and performing, there is kind of this hyper focus where you sort of have to ignore the other person.
I really like that. And thank you. And I feel like that probably does end up coming from composing it at the piano, just me. And so in the end, it is all kind of coming from one body. And that's maybe another part of, as you were talking about with All in the Sound, that poetry has a vocal embodiment that similarly in my compositional process has a physical embodiment, which I think comes out in the interdependence of the parts, even if the learning process does require occasionally some blinders.
I'm curious, Valerie, you mentioned something initially about this piece, about the sense of having very much to say tied to exactly what's in front of you, in front of your eyes and under your fingers in the moment. Do you have a sense specifically with this movement of being almost like a collaborative automaton? Is there a sense of almost mechanization here that does seem to be rather not contradictory, but add new nuances to this idea of the organic plant life that is the topic?
Absolutely. I think the kind of the machination of it is really interesting to point out. The other day, I was sharing with somebody, a non-musician who had never heard of the composer or the piece. I was sharing Rzewski's Winsboro Cotton Mill Blues and how that captures that driving rhythmic nature of the cotton mills and the machinery kind of at play. And just there's this like perpetual motion to it that no matter what is happening in the factory, no matter what the workers are doing, no matter what connection they're creating and what meaning they're finding in life, the machines still continue. And I think there's an aspect of that here. And I think it's interesting that you highlight the or just a juxtaposition to the text. And maybe it's not so much a juxtaposition as like an accentuation. You more deeply appreciate this April leaf in contrast to the machinery of life.
Well, I'll just say, because a few different pieces use, you could say motoric repetition or just intense repetition, that I would be very happy to discuss decoupling mechanization from repetition. And that, repetition and literal repetition, highly rhythmicized repetition is also a big part of ritual, is a big part of maybe not the most organic of activities if we're talking about maybe animal behavior, but animals also do very literal repetitions and exact repetitions of things in ways that push back on the idea that repetition is inherently mechanical. And definitely one of the things that I appreciate about your performance, Valerie, is bringing still the expressivity of a collaborative pianist to all of these intense repeated rhythms.
And I buy your point, Peter, and I agree. I think nature is so meaningful in part because of its rhythms and cycles and kind of the liturgy of life that is the natural world.
It's a pretty wonky machine if you think about the rhythmic pattern involved and thinking of that as like the rotation of a single wheel. That is a strangely shaped wheel that keeps on going around.
Sounds almost like the again, metaphorically, I wonder if the piano, the accompaniment, the collaborative piano work can be metaphorically tied to that rhythm of leaf growth, which is never linear, sometimes cyclical, always in motion, even if it's a motion that is not something easily perceivable by we mere humans. Speaking of Botticellian trees, Peter, another question for you. This piece is the earliest one that you've composed on this album, and in comparison with your previous album, Stories Out of Cherry Stems, which didn't have any songs with keyboard accompaniment, All in the Sound features mostly piano-paired pieces. Can you talk about your choice of instrumental pairings and how Botticellian Trees specifically fits into the trajectory of your vocal music?
First of all, it's good to bring up Stories Out of Cherry Stems because Botticellian Trees was meant to be on that album. And while I wrote every note and should have known the duration of everything, I seemingly couldn't add up the duration of all the pieces and make 80 minutes. And so Botticellian Trees, unfortunately, was a darling killed from the first album, which was specifically highlighting my collaborative work with Katie Purcell, and then made it onto this one. But I still think it fits with a number of themes that go throughout the album. Of course, modernist American poets, nature. It's juxtaposed with Just a Leaf as being similarly tree and nature themed, but also sort of using nature as a conduit to discussing human emotions and as a symbol of the human psyche. Botticellian Trees speaks to a point in my creative development where I was really struggling to work with the piano. As a self-taught pianist, or largely self-taught, though I did take lessons in undergrad. If my piano teacher is watching this, she should know that I learned quite a lot from her, but it's still something where I have felt like sometimes I write to my own physical limitations in a way that writing for other instrumental combinations frees me of that from a creative perspective, and writing for instruments like violin or cello or guitar, where the idiosyncrasies of the instrument themselves lend a kind of compositional path into what the piece will be. It can come from the idiom of the instrument itself in a way that maybe because actually I'm too close to the piano, it's hard for me to think of it in that way. I just think of it as the thing that I compose on. And so it's kind of too creatively blank in that way to think about as a piano. So maybe I need to step away from the piano for a long time before I compose a piano piece.
The second movement of Botticellian's Trees stands out to me because it is sort of, as we discussed with Just a Leaf, the relationship between the instrumentalist and the singer. The second movement is very much kind of like moving together in a different way than the other movements of Botticellian Trees. The second movement opens with the vocal line and the violin line kind of moving in tandem. With the violin, you've got all of these like textural options here. So maybe that's something you could speak to.
It is a very particular mode or tactic of vocal writing that I think is more instinctive to happen in something like a pairing of a monophonic or non-piano instrument with voice. It would be very rare, I think, to occur to me to write just a single line in exact homorythmic accompaniment with the voice. There's something incredibly intimate about this kind of writing that I think feels appropriate for this, and actually a piece that's going to be premiered on my birthday this year for soprano and viola. The last movement also does this, and that is a particularly intimate movement. And so there's something about this kind of cradling of the voice with another part that feels appropriate here, but there's also a certain abstraction to the text in both cases, which, in absence of a kind of space or setting, that the close homorythmic accompaniment is kind of either avoiding or obviating that sense of spaciousness that can come with something like the first movement, which has, among the leaves, bright green. It's evocative of an entire natural environment. And the idea of the alphabet of the trees is fading in the songs of the leaves. Yes, there are physical objects in there, but it's also incredibly abstract and kind of doesn't actually evoke much of an image to me. We get the images at various points later, and certainly a woman's limbs under cloth is a very evocative image, but this particular opening, this particular opening feels very interior to me. And that sort of accompaniment, I think, can facilitate that. But also, there's a lot of power in string instruments versus, say, Desiderata from Stories Out of Cherry Stems as a true one-line instrument. You can only do so much, and there's a wonderful interplay for the violin where you could have a note and then sustain that note and double stop and do another note as well, so it can both pause and keep going in ways that have interesting dramatic potential and timing that I explore occasionally in this movement.
As a side note, and I might be biased in this just because I got to be involved kind of on the back end theoretical side with both albums, but I think this piece might function very nicely as an elision between the two, connecting the two albums, because they are connected in some really interesting ways. So I'm seeing threads braided together here. If They Delight. Valerie, I know that you've played this piece at least 4 times in concert since premiering it with soprano Katie Purcell in 2018. And then, of course, you've also gone through the entire rehearsal and recording processes with this piece. And while others have played it in other places, you have performed it the most. Can you talk about your relationship with the piece, especially with your role as being its primary interpreter?
I can't separate my musical reflections on this piece from personal sentiments about the piece, because this piece was my first reintroduction to Peter's music after many years where I hadn't heard or performed his work. And so it also not only marked the beginning of our current professional collaboration through the years, but also our personal friendship at the same time. So I think this piece to me evokes things like friendship and trust and encouragement and generosity. And these are the things that I treasure about our friendship, Peter. And I can't detangle that from my musical thoughts about this work. I will say, though, about performing the work this many times, that I was so thrilled to record it with Ariana after having performed it with Katie Purcell many times before. Hearing the two of their voices in the same work, bringing out very different things, it made me hear it differently, rehearsing and recording with Ariana. So that was a really interesting experience because I thought I knew the piece so well. And then I showed up at my first rehearsal with Ariana and I'm hearing something that I'm just hearing some note that I had never heard before, but it's the same note. It just sounded so different because of the different timbre of her voice.
I really love hearing the way you depict this relationship between piece, performer, and context, and being able to, as it were, really dive into that reality that each time you perform a piece, no matter how well you know it or no matter how long you've worked with it, it is yet again brand new. Well, I've got another question for you, and Peter, you might want to hop into this as well. With same piece again. Peter's program notes on this piece, of course, mention that the first movement contains material used in Peter's chamber opera about Gertrude Stein entitled May She, She May. You've played both one of the keyboard parts in a full ensemble performance and then also the piano reduction in the performance by Opera Alchemy immediately before the pandemic started. With your experience of both of these versions of it, if I may call it that, can you talk about how they relate and if or how your experience with the opera specifically informs your performance of this piece?
So If They Delight to me feels like a preview or a trailer of the full opera. I think there's a simplicity and a clarity to If They Delight that doesn't exist in the opera. And I think it reflects in some ways the clarity with which Gertrude Stein saw herself by the time of Stanzas and Meditation, which is the text that is the basis for If They Delight. I mean, the opera is really about grappling with identity. It's about grappling with relationships. It's about identity through relationships. And also this question of is there identity without relationships? And so it's much more layered and complicated and complex and frankly, very difficult in a way that If They Delight is not. So the clarity and simplicity I really deeply appreciate about If They Delight, especially having performed May She, She May.
Peter, did you want to add any context or anything else to that?
I'm completely delighted by everything that Valerie has just said. So many marvelous insights there that it's wonderful to hear. I think Valerie's right as far as just simplicity and clarity and room to breathe. I will say that, and maybe this is appropriate given where Gertrude Stein was in her life and her situation, that May She, She May is sort of texturally and rhythmically and almost harmonically a bit of a claustrophobic piece. It's very dense, verbally very dense as well, until essentially the very end. And so even the small gesture that ends up from this song cycle in the opera is presented in almost a hyperactive manic way. The melodic da 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 is presented in one of the last movements, one of the big, I think it's the exchange of letters between Gertrude and May. And there it's kind of da 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 da. It's much more, again, frantic and dense in a way that here it really has time to breathe. And I absolutely adore what Valerie said about connecting it to where Stein was at the point when she was writing the stanzas of meditation versus where she was in her own life during her time at Hopkins, which is when the opera is set. So yeah, I'm taking that one to the bank. That was some really incredible insights there, Valerie.
Peter, I have another question for you, moving on to Beyond Dimension. Can you talk about the origins of this piece and of the text and of the story of how you came to encounter an unpublished fragment that you've since set to music?
I love the poetry of Vicky Hearn. I don't know if many people have heard of her before, but she is a philosopher, scholar, animal rights activist. Her poetry is truly exquisite and often very abstract in its content. And so I wrote a piece back in maybe 2015 based on a poem of hers called The Tree That Plucks Fruit. And that's a piece for mixed chorus. And I was writing to her husband, who has survived her and is the executor of her literary estate, asking for permission to use the text of that piece. And he kindly granted it and was so delighted by my setting of her poem that he shared that unpublished fragment with me. And so I think of it as a gift. It was a gift, absolutely. And it was so strange, both in its level of abstraction and the nature of the concrete images that ground it. And then that I was told that there was a line that was crossed out in the poem itself. It was still on the page, but it was crossed out. And so in my musical setting, you hear the words that are crossed out, and then you hear the gesture repeated in the harp part to try to straddle that divide of, you can clearly see the words even though they're crossed out. And so you know that they are there and not there at the same time. And it's funny because the poem ends with the line, with closure absolute, which is exactly what both an unpublished fragment and a piece and a poem that has a visible strike through in it can't accomplish.
Moving on to hidden texts. Peter, most, but not quite all of the songs that are on this album feature texts by just one single poet, and his hidden text really stands out in this regard. And your program notes suggest that you have constructed your own narrative out of pairing these two texts, almost like a kind of fan fiction or even headcanon. Can you talk about your vision of these two songs and their relationship to text?
These two songs are really just one of them, the bit from John Hollander's Reflections on Espionage. I really think of in the way that you might see a book that's like 20 monologues for young actors or something. There's a certain scenario there, which many of the other poems that I write feel like they're kind of coming from a more abstract or ethereal place. The speaker feels more diffuse and less clear-cut as a character. And that particular poem very much has a character who is on stage in a sense. Do Not Be Ashamed was written first. That's the second movement. And that was written for a multidiscipline art performance series that I was a co-founder of and executed called Amplified Cactus. This is back in 2015. And I wrote the piece for that and performed it. And that was right around the beginning of the Trump administration. And so the ideas of the text and the very clear anti-authoritarianism, standing up for one's own identity, pushing back against fascism seemed to be an appropriate matter to discuss. So then the Hollander came afterwards and felt like it was a different approach to the same topic, or almost like the precipitation of the crisis that is Do Not Be Ashamed. And so the narrative is of a secret agent who is writing in code and meditating on code as a kind of art, or poetry as a kind of code, the ways in which we convey meaning indirectly and the beauty that can arise from that. So there's clearly a speaker on stage. I think that pairing the two contextualizes Do Not Be Ashamed from less of an abstract speaker space, and that becomes more of a character study. I would like to see these performed as a pair And speaking just a little more to the importance of friendships and relationships, actually, Valerie helped me premiere these two as a set on piano because of a series of last minute personnel changes due to illness in a concert. And so I think overnight I adapted the piece to two staves instead of guitar staff, and Valerie learned them in a hot second, and then we performed them maybe 36 hours later. I'm very grateful for I put Valerie through a lot, and she has come through.
And Peter, I have one more question for you in this trio of questions aimed at you. Turning to Like a Red, Red Rose, this is by far the most traditional text on the album, and I was actually, I confess, rather surprised to see it. And I'm curious what brought you to this text, especially considering that your tastes in poetry, in your own words, tend to be skewed towards the modern.
It's true, and I don't think I would have much interest in this poetry if it weren't for another friendship. So my oldest friend from high school was dating and is now married to an absolutely marvelous woman who runs or organizes an annual Robert Burns night. And so when they invited my husband and I to come to these Burns nights, I was completely intoxicated by, first of all, actually examining Robert Burns's poetry, learning more about the context in which he was writing, just the fun experience of reading poetry communally. I can't remember before that the last time that I had been in a group of people and read a poem aloud and everyone was enjoying it deeply. And so that was a powerful experience. And I wrote this after a virtual Burns night, either after or before, I can't remember. I wrote this around a virtual Burns night that happened during the pre-vaccine part of the global pandemic. And as a consolation gift, as a kind of gift to my friends Jeffrey and Jane, who were not married at the time, but were living apart after being together in Baltimore. Jane moved back to her home state as she completed her dissertation. And so the theme of the poem is, well, it ends up being kind of about distance or about the enduring qualities of love over time. And so as Burns is Jane's favorite poet, it was a chance to do a little something for a friend.
Valerie, a rather complex two-part question for you. This is, of course, an album exclusively of Peter's music, and so a full listen through of this album can reveal some of the consistencies in Peter's compositions that could perhaps be called his voice, the composer's voice. For example, the middle movement of Wild Colors bears some resemblance to the winter movements of both Just a Leaf and Botticellian Trees. Now, with your unusually rich experience of other Peter Dayton, specifically voice and keyboard pieces, was there anything on this album that either surprised you as being outside your expectations of Peter's voices, and or B, stands out specifically as a distinct and excellent example of Peter's voice?
So I think Wild Colors is the right piece to be discussing when we talk about like Peter's voice, because I hear so many of those like tropes and gestures that are just so distinctive of Peter's vocal music in particular and keyboard music. I think if somebody were to play for me the first movement of Wild Colors, I would know immediately that it was Peter's piece, more so than the second movement, which is what you referenced, Ryan, in its similarities to the winter movements. I've got the score here in front of me, and just looking at it, certain things that stand out are some things like the intervallic relationships. I think throughout this first movement, you see a lot of sixths collapsing into fifths, which actually reminds me most of the third movement of Just a Leaf, where you've got those sixths collapsing into fourths. And also, like that third movement of Just a Leaf, you've got that relationship between the duple and the triple rhythmic patterns. So the sudden introduction of triplets and the texture change that brings about. I'm just flipping through the score here, just noticing things. I think in the middle of that first movement of Wild Colors, there's this ascending scale that is like identical to something at the end of the first movement of Just a Leaf in the same key as well. So it's just very distinctively like this earworm that when I hear it, it just brings me right back to that place. And I think also going back to that conversation we had earlier about repetition, you've got these minor seconds throughout this first movement of Wild Colors that to me, it harkens all in the sound with the repeating minor seconds. So I just see like Peter music fingerprints all throughout this piece. So it was a delight to listen to because it feels like a little showcase of all of his tricks. And I know you have more tricks than this, but
I'm curious, Valerie, if there were any pieces on the album as a whole that kind of surprised you as sounding not Peter-like, or moving beyond your expectations of what a Peter piece be characterized as?
I would say The Second Coming is the farthest outside of the classic Peter Dayton sound on this album. And I think it's in texture, it's in the interaction of the lines. I think because so much of Peter's music that I've performed is for solo voice and piano and other ensemble works like the chamber opera and The Need for Comrades. Those are other larger ensemble pieces, but I feel like the texture of those have more space in a way that The Second Coming does not.
It's definitely an outlier in almost every respect as being one that has the most low voices. You're entirely right, I think, Valerie, about the idea of texture in it. And it actually, I would say, harkens to earlier work of mine. There was a brief period where I fancied myself a choral composer, but I decided that I didn't want to write sacred music, which is already a strike, and that I wasn't necessarily writing music that was at a accessible difficulty level. So with few takers on those pieces, that brief period ended. But this is definitely pulling out a lot of different stops. And I think what is afforded by having multiple voices, and this particular, rather than the opera, which has multiple characters who are saying different things, this is multiple voices declaiming the same text, but the way in which multiple voices can declaim a text itself can inform, clarify, or comment on the text in a way that you can sometimes get a bit of that in imitation with the voiceless musical instrument in a just two-person piece, but the effect is very different. This piece itself is a bit of a puzzle, even for me, because of the other things on here are clearly what we would call art songs or some sort of song. This is a piece for multiple voices that's not for chorus, but it's not a song setting. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule, maybe, is the lazy answer that still sounds clever. But I think the text itself is something that I wanted to include in this, and it seems to fit between a bunch of different themes, in between some of the mix between fascist and almost apocalyptic images that are in bits of hidden texts. The song set as a whole, of course, modernist poetry brings in Williams and Stein, and the Irish element from Oscar Wilde, and also his more pungent images. And then the connection to the last piece on the album, where I wrote these pieces roughly around the same time as requests for friends. And so definitely the friend who requested this got more than they bargained for, because I think they wanted probably voice and piano, and I just couldn't hear the text that way. But I kind of feel these pieces are connected because the authors were working on the texts around the same time, or we're grappling with the same things of the horrors of the First World War. How do we understand society now in the wake of this massive atrocity? This, and then the piece inspired by Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. They're a very strange set of bedfellows.
Speaking of another standout piece, stylistically standout, Fresh in the Triumph, which for me, again, it was a Peter Dayton, and it fit within this garden of Peter Dayton flowers that are the different pieces. But it was a very different flower. I don't know how better to describe it. And Peter, I'm curious, what's the story behind this piece? How did it come about? How did it come to be on this album?
A very good friend of mine from the start of my time in Baltimore, because I moved here in 2014 for my master's degree at Peabody, that was his favorite book. And Jason Robert Brown is one of his favorite composers. So this friend's husband actually commissioned me to write this piece for his birthday. And so I came up with the idea of it because I knew about his love of Mrs. Dalloway, and the whole book revolves around a birthday party, or rather the framework, I should say. The framework of the book is around this birthday party, and the narrative is very fragmented, and it's a wonderful piece of modernist literature. The book itself is very intertextual and has a big quote from Shakespeare's Cymbeline, specifically a song from that, Fear No More the Heat of the Sun, which is a very nihilistic kind of, somewhere between nihilistic and maybe stoicist kind of, don't mourn the dead because they're not suffering anymore. And trying to reject that idea is the main thrust of the song, in a way that maybe speaks to trying to abolish the fears of age, since we live in a very ageist society. there's a lot of pressure surrounding age, and a lot of pressure surrounding age for gay men in particular. And so the idea that this is speaking against that kind of capitulation to fear of death and fear even of age is the main idea of the song.
So to start, I want to take issue with something you said, Peter. In talking about Mrs. Dalloway, you said that the narrative is very fragmented. I disagree with that. Even though you're looking at these intersecting lives and these intersecting stories that actually intersecting may not be the right word because a lot of these lives don't intersect at all. But you've got this very close, very omniscient third person narrator that's like shifting between consciousnesses in this very smooth and seamless way. So that as a reader, you don't necessarily realize that you're reading fragmented narratives. The experience of it is seamless. What first stood out to me listening to this song was that it's in the first person, which I am curious about the choice of that, Peter, because neither Mrs. Dalloway nor the Hours, there are no first person voices in there. And because of that ability of this close third person narrator to move between consciousnesses, no matter how close they are to the action, or even close to the characters, they are always an observer. And so I think by putting it in the first person and by performing this song in the first person, you are kind of thrusting the observer role on the audience. And so it's a very different experience of these characters, of the voice of Mrs. Dalloway, which I think is who you hear as singing this text. And so as a reader, as a listener, you are no longer being forced into a perspective. You are now invited to create your own perspective. And in a way, it's as if we are invited to experience what it's like to move between consciousnesses. We are now the observer who is invited and who has the ability to perceive and inspect and be closely embedded with the consciousnesses of each other. So I am curious, Peter, about your choice to set this in the first person. And was that discussed with your friend who's the Dalloway fan?
Wow, what an amazing answer. And I fully accept your pushback on fragmented. And the other phrase that came to mind either during or after was stream of consciousness, which I think speaks to that continuity more and speaks also to Virginia Woolf's writing methods in dialogue with other important modernist writers at the time, like James Joyce. So yes, stream of consciousness speaks more to the experience of reading it than fragmented narrative. You examine this with such wonderful intention in ways that I definitely didn't when I composed it, as far as putting parts of it together in just assembling the lyrics that I wrote for this. I pulled verbatim what I thought were evocative or emotionally appropriate parts from the text. So the line right near the end about what is this terror? What is this ecstasy? That's directly from the text. There's the bit about the high airplane above the ground, the triumph and the jingle that was also pulled directly from the text. So I assembled the text in part from what I felt were poignant images, phrases, that sort of thing. But yes, kind of saw the text as being from the perspective of Clarissa Dalloway. I'll have to run through the text itself to see if the word I ever comes up. It's first person by implication because it uses the second person. I don't think there is an instance of using the word I, but it uses you. And I definitely was thinking about it as what is the context of the piece being performed. And it was performed at a birthday party. So with the idea that I am addressing the birthday boy, if you will, Clarissa is both maybe the speaker and the you, or the recipient of the thing, since she is the one who is having this sort of identity crisis or personal crisis. So the optimism of the song is, you could think of it as a song by Clarissa to herself, and she is both the I and the you, maybe. But also, yes, I think certainly as I conceived it as being performed in front of a very specific audience, there is definitely an audience in mind in the text.
May I observe how much I enjoy the way the two of you think together and play off one another, both musically and conceptually and relationally.
It's just been so lovely talking to you both, and I hope you enjoyed the full album experience.
I did. Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed getting to listen to it first, second.
Yeah, essentially, one of the first.
So thank you.
And congratulations you both for your respective vital roles to it.